pleasure to have you here. We would like to know a little bit about an overview of the research paper you just showed us.
Sure. Yeah. So the paper that I just presented in North Africa, it's a paper on the causes of conflict, which is definitely a topic that's sort of at the forefront of thinking in development economics in Africa at the moment. It's not a paper that uses African data, but it's something that I hope can speak to that broader literature. And it begins with a pretty straightforward puzzle, which is, why does war happen? Which sounds like a pretty obvious question to ask, but it's an important one because war is costly. It's costly along many dimensions. It's costly in terms of human capital destruction, physical capital destruction, it erodes state capacity and so on. And so the sort of puzzle for economists is, if it's so destructive, you could have an allocation of resources before a conflict, all right, that would be larger than the allocation of resources after the conflict. Any arrangement that happens post-conflict could have been located beforehand with room to spare, right? So that means a logical theory of conflict has to allow for the failure of a negotiated settlement. Okay, what stopped the two sides from coming up with some bargaining solution that prevents conflict and leaves both better off? Okay, and that's a critical part, both better off. And we test an old theory that we don't think has been tested before, which is the simple idea that if there are political leaders who stand to gain from war, but don't internalize the costs, then you could have a world with more conflict than what's socially optimal. Okay, if I stand to gain, I don't stand to lose, I might as well wage a war and engage in a conflict. So what we need to test this is we need to find some change in the costs or benefits of conflict to a political leader. Okay, we need to find some change in the extent to which a political leader is going to either benefit from or suffer from conflict. And the way we did this is we looked at how US politicians voted for war and for conscription in the 20th century. And our basic idea is actually quite straightforward. If you're a politician with a son of draft age, okay, so a son who's registered for the draft and can be enlisted, and I'm a politician with a daughter of the same age, what's the difference between you and me? You're more exposed to the cost of conflict than I am, and our main argument in the paper is that we're otherwise identical. Particularly in a large enough sample, we're otherwise the same. So now we have something we can bring to the data. Okay? If you are less likely to vote for the draft than I am, we've demonstrated that if you're more exposed to the cost of conflict, you're less likely to engage in it. And that's what we find. We find that legislators who have sons of draft age are between about 10 and 17% less likely to vote for conscription than otherwise comparable legislators with daughters of draft age. So it's like a natural experiment, right? It's like varying the exposure to conflict for one politician and not another, and seeing how that affects how they vote.
Perfect. And how do you think this kind of research can influence policy making or elections, maybe?
So that's the tricky part. Any paper in political economy has a challenge when it comes to policy implications, because very often the conclusion of a paper is, here's how politicians behave, or here's how institutions are structured in a way that isn't benefiting society. So there's a logical problem, right? Your solution, your policy solution, has to be enacted by the people who are right, who are not acting in the interest of the electorate. But there are things that civil society can do. I think that's sort of the more optimistic side of political economy, right? A lot of the policy implications are not policies for governments, they're policies for people. And what we've shown is, going back to our example, right, when you're the politician with the son of draft age, you're less likely to vote for war than I am, okay? It suggests that there's some reason for me to vote for war. I'm gaining something, okay? And what the paper speaks to more broadly is, what are the assets and liabilities that a politician has? What do politicians have to gain and lose from different policies? If you and I were both acting in the interest of every single voter, we would have voted the same. The fact that we voted differently means one of us is not acting in the citizens' interest. And so one, I think, again, more optimistic implication would be, if we have more information on what politicians stand to gain and lose when they make decisions, if journalists can tell us more about the extent to which a politician is going to benefit from a certain law or not, that should improve our ability to make good decisions at the ballot box.
And do you would suggest, or you have already some research that would go further on this topic? Or?
Well, what this would suggest would be some sort of informational campaigns exposing or shining a light on politicians' interests should ultimately affect how they vote. It's interesting you raise the question because at Nova Africa, one of your directors, Pedro Vicente, is doing really frontier research in the area of information and voting. It's, I think, a really, really important area, whether in Africa or elsewhere. And one I'll certainly keep a close eye on, and maybe even start something there.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.